So the government has finally published its plans for achieving net zero emissions by 2050. They include grants of up to £5,000 for households to replace boilers with energy-efficient heat pumps and subsidies for electric cars. It's claimed over 400,000 jobs will be created in the process. But critics have warned that the plans do not go far enough. Here's our business and trade correspondent, Paul McNamara.
It's taken a while, but today liftoff on a strategy the man pulling the levers says should make the UK a virtually zero carbon economy by 2050.
Is that it? Yeah. Well,
talking to a room full of billionaires, the Prime Minister adopted language he hoped they might understand.
To adapt Gordon Gekko, green is good, green is right, green works.
And then the vision through green-tinted lenses of how a low-carbon future will be paid for.
Innovation, capitalism and a strong government lead, because we face a challenge that is even bigger for humanity, a threat to our way of life that is ultimately far worse than COVID.
Among the industrial relics that made the West rich, but also started the spiral of emissions that had driven climate change, £10 billion of investment by private companies in UK green growth were announced. And for those not wealthy enough to be in this room, heat pump handouts, grants of £5,000 to households in England and Wales.
The questions I would probably ask, is the amount sufficient? Low-income households will need further help and support in terms of being able to provide further assistance from a financial point of view to help them introduce this type of technology.
In total, £450 million, which will pay to replace 90,000 gas boilers, which is a lot until you compare it to the number of gas boilers installed last year, 1.7 million. Along with that heat pump funding, there'll be £620 million in grants for electric vehicles and charge points, a similar sum for tree planting and peat bogs, £140 million to promote carbon capture and storage, and £120 million for small modular nuclear reactors on areas about the size of 2 football pitches.
2 football pitches.
Yeah. Driving that small-scale nuclear revolution is Rolls-Royce.
So the small modular nuclear reactor, we'd love to get that on the grid before the end of the decade, and that's our ambition, but right now it's that sort of time period.
So that sounds like it's going to be costly.
Well, of course it's going to be costly. We're talking about a whole ecosystem that doesn't exist today.
Giving that ecosystem life, say Labour, will need much more money from government.
The plan falls short on delivery. And while there is modest short-term investment, there is nothing like the commitment we believe is required. Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that despite hundreds of pages of plans, strategies and hot air, there is still a chasm with this government between the rhetoric and the reality?
Today was a day of big, bold announcements and a bit of billionaire backslapping, but also, some argue, greenwashing. The Prime Minister spoke of the trillions in spending power in the hands of the investors in that room, money that could go into green investments. But among them were big names that between them have invested hundreds of billions in fossil fuel projects and still do. So whatever the Prime Minister may have said, there is still a long way to go into convincing these investors that either long-term green is more profitable, or morally, whatever the returns from these quote-unquote dirty investments are, they're just not worth it.
We think that the investment is potentially very valuable if it's in genuinely green investments, but we need to take a look at the same time that all the greenwash that goes with it. So many of the same banks and financiers that the Prime Minister is courting today are heavily implicated in the financing of fossil fuels that are cooking our planet and potentially incinerating our future and that of our children as well.
Today's announcements have been broadly welcomed by business. Few think they're enough to deliver all Boris Johnson hopes, but the general consensus is it's a good start. In less than 2 weeks, though, world leaders descend on the UK for the global climate conference COP26, where the Prime Minister doesn't just have to convince them it's a good start, but that they should do the same.
Paul McNamara. So do today's raft of government announcements go far enough to meet the challenge? In a moment, we'll be hearing from our political editor, Gary Gibbon. But first, our climate reporter, Simon Roach, is in Glasgow, where the decisive climate COP summit will be held in just 12 days' time. Simon.
John, if you take the totality of all of the climate policy documents put online today, they actually come to over 1,500 pages. So it's been very busy, but just bear with me. I think it's important, first off, just to understand where we're at currently. The UK has very ambitious climate targets. It wants to reduce its emissions by 78% by 2035 and to be net zero by 2050. Now, the problem is that current policies don't take us anywhere near meeting them. That's what the documents today try to address. They say that the biggest contributions to carbon reductions over the next 10 years will be from industry. They'll be from steel and cement production, and indeed from the heat and buildings strategy that we've been hearing so much about. They say we'll be relying much less on oil and gas production in power than we have done currently, and that will protect us from some of the price shocks we've seen in fossil fuels recently. Now, in short, this is a plan, and it's very important to stress that it's a plan which may help us meet those climate targets.
Well, that sounds positive enough, but is there a catch, Simon?
Well, the problem here is that once you go beyond that plan and into the specific policies, that's when it becomes a little bit muddier. Let's take agriculture, for example. It contributes a fifth of the UK's carbon emissions, and yet there is very little in today's plan about how we can decarbonise there. Behaviour change. We all need to eat much less meat in the future if we're to meet our climate targets, and yet the government gave very little there again. Now, the green groups I spoke to today said that they're quite sceptical still when the government is subsidising fossil fuels with one arm and then rolling out these green policies with the other. Other experts I spoke to said that ultimately they're going to see much more detail on the specific policies that are part of these strategies before they're truly encouraged. Ultimately, the main thing will be that these plans are only as good as the money that's backing them, and at the moment there's simply not enough of that.
Simon Roach reporting. Well, now, on that issue of money, the Treasury has released its analysis of the plan today as well. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster. Gary, what did we learn?
Well, as Simon was saying there, climate change groups have been saying for years that this will cost a lot of money to turn an economy around and make it carbon neutral. How much money is the Treasury actually adding to what it's already spending on all of that? Well, it's not clear from these documents. It may be slightly clearer when we get the spending round, but you wouldn't want to bet the house on it. Some green pressure groups have been having a go at trying to crack through the numbers. One of them reckons there's not much more than about £1 billion extra a year that the Treasury has committed to here. And that opens up quite a lot of clear red water between Labour, which is committed to 28 billion a year of additional spending, and the Tory party. But it also tells you a bit about the Tory party's plan of action. Boris Johnson, as you were hearing in Paul's report, has been speaking to business and in a tone, a very friendly tone, which is not always the one he adopts with business. He wants business to put in £90 billion of investment a year into all of this, and that raises all sorts of questions about whether they can do it and also where their costs go. If business costs go up, they tend to pass them on in prices. That's not very redistributive, and that could mean that poorer people end up paying for more of this green revolution than might be equitable. Some Tories who are sceptics about all of this as saying, well, in the end, that will be what takes Boris Johnson off this track, and it will be the opinion polls telling him that the cost of living is going up. But right now, you have to say that there is very big stuff in this announcement today, big policy changes like requiring car manufacturers to do a certain amount of their cars as electric vehicles, mandating them to do it, very big stuff which Tory Prime Ministers like David Cameron wouldn't have done in the past, didn't, but there is a question about delivery.
Gary Gibbon reporting.
Well, joining me now is the Energy Minister, Lord Callanan. Well, perhaps you can answer that question of Gary Gibbons of how much the Treasury is putting in to this plan, because we know Labour would spend £28 billion a year on transforming home heating, energy and transport. How much has the Treasury given you?
Well, I mean, in the heating building strategy alone, we're putting in £3.9 billion on top of, I might say, of the 6-odd billion pounds that we've already invested in this, plus extra money for transport decarbonisation as well.
Is that extra on what you'd already promised in your manifesto?
Money that was it's the first payment up front on the money that was promised in the manifesto.
Yeah, so it's what you'd already promised before, so it's not extra money. The Treasury seems to have cut you off.
Sorry, Gary, it is extra money. This is money that we have secured in the spending review on top of what we are already spending.
Right.
Yes, it was money that was promised in the manifesto, but this is additional spending.
In terms of your home heating plan, you need to change about 15 million homes from gas boilers to air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps. Why are you only funding 30,000 a year for 3 years?
Okay, you've got the figures wrong, Gary. For a start, there will be, this is a program that will last over 15 years. We're not going to replace all home heating systems with electric heat pumps. There will be a range of different measures. Some homes will be heated by hydrogen, some will be heated by heat networks, and some will be heated by heat pumps, as you have mentioned. So what we're doing is we're kickstarting the market. We're providing £450 million over 3 years to provide upfront grants of £5,000 for air source heat pumps, £6,000 for ground source heat pumps. But in addition to that, we have a future home standards coming in 2025, which will obligate all new homes to be low carbon.
But just on this scheme,
under that.
It's a tiny number of homes, isn't it?
It's not a tiny number of homes.
What, 90,000 homes?
It's £450 million. Sorry, say that again, please.
Do you think 90,000 homes is a lot?
That is not the totality. We have a number of other schemes, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund as well, and they will all contribute to the heat pump target. This is about kickstarting the market. I visited Octopus Heating today, and they're planning on the back of this announcement, as well as training thousands of new engineers. In April next year, they will be launching an offer to consumers that will allow heat pumps to match the cost of existing gas boilers.
Yeah, and if you go to their website now, it tells you that if you switch to a heat pump, your energy bill will go up because of the energy crisis at the moment.
Well, no, that's not true.
Why would you do this?
Gas prices are already going up. Our research shows that the cost of running a heat pump is broadly equivalent to that of a gas boiler. But your general point is right. We need to look in a few years' time at rebalancing the costs of gas and electricity. Heat pumps are much more efficient than gas boilers, but at the moment, gas is relatively more expensive. So that's one of the things that over time we will need to look at.
I just don't know why you're so
fix. This is a change that will happen over 10 to 15 years.
About the numbers, because your previous scheme, the Renewable Energy Initiative scheme, was more generous than this new scheme. It would pay you thousands of pounds for up to 7 years if you wanted to.
It was a different scheme.
And that's why, the scheme was highly criticised, and it's been withdrawn because it was actually not very good value for money. It was too generous in some people's opinion. That scheme only got about 12,000 applicants approved last year. So why do you think this one, which is less generous, is going to have 3 times as many people taking it up?
It's not less generous. It's a different scheme. The scheme that you were talking about was the renewable heat incentive, and that was revenue support over a number of different years. This is a straight upfront cash grant payment paid to installers to directly subsidise the costs of installation of new heat pumps. And as I've already said, the cost of heat pumps will come down over time once we build up the market.
Maybe.
Already some suppliers are planning to launch new products that will match the cost of existing gas boilers.
It's just a shot in the dark, isn't it? That's the truth. You're just guessing that prices are going to come down, you're hoping, but you've actually got no plan to make it happen.
I visited a company today, as I've already said, Octopus, who are already planning to launch new heat pumps onto the market next year using this grant, whereby the cost would be broadly equivalent to replacing a gas boiler. And other manufacturers I know are planning to open new plants and do the same.
Lord Callanan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, earlier I spoke to Caroline Lucas, the co-leader of the Green Party, and asked her what she made of the government's strategy, the former co-leader of the Green Party, and asked her what she made of the government's strategy to replace gas boilers with heat pumps.
There's some fine words, but no real seriousness when it comes to the finance necessary to scale up fast enough. And I would also make sure that there was a proper, comprehensive, street-by-street home insulation scheme, because we know that if you go around putting heat pumps into homes that haven't been properly insulated, it's the same as basically using a teapot that's full of cracks. It's leaky, it's inefficient, and it's a waste of money. So those two things had to go together. There needed to be an investment of a far greater amount than we've seen from government. And we know, because there's so much evidence out there, that if you invest in the green economy, it is one of the fastest ways of getting a high return on your investment. It's one of the most effective ways of creating jobs. It would align with the government's rhetoric about levelling up. And it's just a great shame that Rishi Sunak essentially is the fossil fuel chancellor. He doesn't recognise that you have to spend in order to be able to get those returns back again.
Right, but the Treasury in their report today are recognising that taxes may have to change and that the current incentives that we have for things like electric cars may end up benefiting the rich who can afford to, the 45,000 for an electric car, and disadvantaging poorer households who just can't. So how do you recognise that the tax system is also going to have to change?
I certainly do recognise that, but I also recognise that if the government ends up making the poorest pay for this, that is a political choice. There's nothing inevitable about it. Many other countries have put in place, for example, grants for those on lower incomes, so they don't have to pay it back. They have recognised, for example, that you can take VAT off green technologies, so that brings the price down as well. They recognise that if you really invest up front in a serious way, then that gets more people engaged, and then the prices of the technology comes down too.
But won't a lot of people be looking at the run-up to COP with, talk of China not turning up and disappointing words from Russia and Australia and all sorts of countries, and say, why should we, either as individuals or as a nation, be running up bills to reduce carbon emissions when they're still going to be on the way up in 2030? It's just not rational to be doing this.
I think there are two responses to that. First of all, it is entirely rational to make sure that we don't have around 10,000 people dying of fuel poverty every year, as we do in this country, because they're living in cold, damp houses. And the second side of it, of course, is that if you look at the cumulative responsibility for the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then the UK actually is responsible for far more than just the 1 or 1.5% that the government is fond of telling you. And if you look again then at the fact that many of the emissions that we're responsible for actually get emitted in other countries like China because they are manufacturing widgets for us. We've offshored most of our manufacturing, so that's very convenient when it comes to emissions because we can pretend it's someone else's problem. In fact, we are responsible ultimately for those emissions in China that are responsible for the goods that we're importing, and they should be on our balance sheet as well. So there's both a kind of economic and moral reason for doing this, but also there's such a prize here for a much better future that we can build together if the government grasps this challenge.
Caroline Lucas.